What we're talking about here is what we're looking for in partners in ministry and staff. And you've stressed prophet, know your theology, king, have the right gifts, and then priestly.
Which is more existential
inside. The personal thing. But I don't want to give the impression, and I'm sure you don't mean to, that the first one's a given and easy.
No.
It's not easy to detect. For this reason, at least tell me if this is right. We have found in our pastoral searches that we have a very significant document called the Elder Affirmation of Faith, and we'll send it out. Yes, no disagreements. That's not what we're after. We're after in staff. This is eldering elder, right? The ability to articulate, defend. So not read a paragraph and agree, which is that's way beyond what most churches do.
You don't want them just to be able to recognize it, but actually produce it.
Yes, because they're called to teach
and defend it.
This is the layer of leadership that have to take probably in our churches pretty competent lay people, and lead them, inspire them, and so finding that I think requires conversation. You get them, first of all, they're signing off, you know what you're coming for, but then you ask them, how do you say particular redemption? How do you say limited atonement?
Explain
you like that phrase?
Right.
Yeah, say it so that a 12-year-old which kind of puts people, it becomes nervous, and people don't like to make people nervous, and therefore a lot of staffing interviews are wimpy because relational feelings are so high. If you start to put somebody on the spot, then you might ruin the relationship before it gets started. And so I think there's a lot of hesitancy even to nail down the prophetic piece.
Interesting. Actually, even that would probably be better discerned if you were if you took longer a period of time and spent a couple of days with people and in a variety of situations than just simply had an interview. Even that would be easier to discern. So
I think there's another thing that I'm sure you would agree with. It's not so much at the discerning level, but the preparation to help people to get to this place where we might want to discern.
You're talking like a seminary professor.
Yeah, but I think it's important. And really I'm talking about not seminary, but beyond seminary. That is, there are an awful lot of things that are caught under mentoring rather than simply taught. I think there's some things that a seminary does very well. I'm not going to start knocking seminaries. Most local churches aren't going to teach Greek exegesis very well or historical theology very richly or all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, I want our best MDivers to come out of here and get placed in churches where there are really first-class, godly pastors who will mentor them. Not just hire them and then give them the youth ministry, but mentor them. They will never preach unless someone has actually gone over their sermon before and then goes over it again afterward. And in evangelism and in elders boards and so on, they're watching somebody think out of the gospel and relate to people properly. I think all kinds of things like that. I can teach in class, but they're not really caught until people have seen it acted out, worked out as a part of the overflow of the Spirit, and then it's so impressed upon them that they're held accountable to it. And I think that if you give young guys 2, 3, 4 years of that, they're 10 years ahead. And instead of having to work out a lot of those things in the first 10 years of their ministry.
Yeah, well, as long as we've gone beyond the question of how do you know who to hire and into mentoring that can last for years, I just want to stress that role of a senior pastor never ends. If the staff's been with him for 20 years, it never ends because you can start to drift in different directions. And I think, weekly, whatever, bi-weekly, you get together with that staff, you lift up a vision from the Word and you embody and model the biblical vision, the centerpieces of the theology, the philosophy of the ministry, year after year after year. I was talking to a pastor here earlier today, whose associate went to a conference of a person he had no respect for at all and came back excited. I just kind of said, how did it happen? And the answer was, this hasn't been going on. In other words, he's so laid back as a leader that his staff has not absorbed his passions. And this guy, the second guy, had been there for quite a while. And they were at odds why this was awkward thing. And I just said to him, how can this happen? Because if you're meeting with your staff regularly and your passions are showing and your understanding of the Bible is showing, then he would know that you regard this person as not a very helpful model in ministry. And evidently, not all senior pastors operate out of that kind of explicit, Bible-saturated passion that ooze all over his staff week after week, so that they're on the same theological, philosophical page.
It was interesting to hear one of our guys actually say that one of the revolutionary steps in his own ministry was starting to take all of his staff to certain conferences, whether T4G or this one or whatever, so that instead of the youth guy going over to a youth conference and somebody else going off to this or that or the other, so they're all flying off in different directions, there's a certain kind of commonality of gospel-centeredness that is stamping everybody, and everybody knows what everybody else is getting, and I think that's really essential. There's one form of diversity in staff that I think can be very helpful, however. It's got nothing to do with our topic of conversation, yet it does relate to it. In a number of churches where I've been, in fact, this conversation came up when I was sitting down with all of the staff at Sandy Wilson's church 2 or 3 years ago. What do we do as a staff to keep up with this issue and that issue and the other issue and so on? And one of the things that I've sometimes suggested in that context is that 1 or 2 staff members become responsible for the literature on homosexuality or on the New Perspective or on something, and then they take responsibility for pooling their studies around the whole board. Now, it's still got to be under some sort of direction and accountability, and there got to be some commonality things that are being read and worked at. But at the same time, pastoral ministry is generalist ministry. I mean, you're facing all kinds of things all the time, aren't you? And it's not an elitist, specialist ministry. And so if you have a multiple staff, you can sometimes multiply the reach of reading and awareness of what's out there by assigning some members of staff to keep abreast of certain things more than others, and then with the aim of informing everybody.
Yeah. Can I shift gears?
Yes, please. We better.
We represent the Gospel Coalition, and we have catchphrases, okay? And so let me toss you one, because you're the gospel guy. Gospel-centered. I think we've been using that somewhat. I'm going to ask you what that is, but let me set it up more specifically, because I know what I want you to say. And then you can say more than I want you to say, okay? Because you're famous for saying something that has been incredibly helpful to me. I hope you know what I'm talking about. Otherwise, you're going to sit there and be flummoxed. What does he want me to say? You have several times given a rationale for why you preach against legalism to libertines. I think I'm saying it right. In other words, secularists who are far from being in any danger at all from being legalists. And when you're preaching evangelistically to them, you're preaching against legalism. And your explanation for why that is unbelievably illuminating. So tie those two together. Gospel-centered. Right. What do we mean here in the Gospel Coalition? And if you can, the answer to why you do that.
Well, the average libertine, the average, you might say, younger brother from the parable of the prodigal son who's picked up and left home, and they're out squandering their lives in riotous living with prostitutes, etc. They think they've rejected Christianity, and they probably rejected a moralism or a kind of churchianity that doesn't actually have the gospel of costly grace at its heart. The gospel of costly grace is that you're saved by sheer grace, not by your works, but it's so costly. It cost nothing less than the death of the Son of God could save you, that he had to pay the penalty for our violations of the law. It brings about, on the one hand, a moral seriousness, because obviously God's will is so important that Jesus had to die to pay the penalty. But at the same time, it means there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. That creates a moral seriousness with a joy, a lack of self-righteousness. And the average person who's rejected Christianity has not rejected that. They've rejected a kind of moralism, self-righteousness, Phariseeism that they have seen in the average church, maybe even in the average conservative church. So unless I deconstruct legalism right before their eyes, they'll think that what I'm actually asking them to get is religious.